Paul was last here about 4 years ago, and we appreciate you coming back to do a program. Last year for Backyard, he's been here, I think, several times to teach a class to Master Gardeners. Paul graduated from Berry College in Rome, Georgia in 2001 with a Bachelor of Science in Horticulture and a minor in Biology. He went on to receive his master's degree in Plant Protection and Pest Management from the University of Georgia in 2003. He became a certified arborist in 2009 through the International Society of Arboriculture. He has worked as an Agriculture and Natural Resource County Extension Agent for UGA Extension in Cherokee County, where he was from 2006 to 2011, when he then moved to Bartow County, where he currently serves as their county extension agent. Welcome, Paul, please.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate the invitation to come back again. It's been a few years since I've had a chance to meet with y'all, and I'm excited to be here again. You always have a great turnout. I'm always impressed with the program that y'all have down here. So tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the perils and pitfalls of overused plants, and a little bit of alliteration here in my title. I had to put a subtitle to this, right? A parody of pests, pathogens, and people. And if that's not enough P's for you, my name, again, is Paul Pugliese, and my degree has a few P's in it as well. Plant Protection and Pest Management is my degree. So if you can say that 3 times really fast, you're doing really good, all right? But tonight's presentation is going to focus on, again, those plants that we get a lot of calls about at the County Extension Office, okay? That's what we do. We take calls from the public, and they're complaining about why something's dying. It could be a tree or a shrub or a flower, and it's the same stuff over and over, and especially after doing this for 17 years, I got a short list of things that I would never plant in my yard, okay? So we're going to take a look at that. We'll take a closer look. If we have a clicker, let's see, are we turned on here? On. It's changing on the computer screen. Oh, it's not started on the slideshow yet. Let's see here.
That's me. That was the first thing.
Well, there we go. So I like to call this the dying dirty dozen, okay? All right. So if any of y'all recall, there was a movie that came out back in the 70s and 80s. I think there were a couple of sequels of the Dirty Dozen that came out. Probably not for the faint of heart. It's a little bit of a bloody war story, right? But we're going to talk about the Dirty Dozen tonight. And I'm going to use some really harsh language when I go to describe these plants tonight. But I would dare say that some of y'all probably have these plants in your backyard. So just taking a quick glance here, how many of y'all have a few of these plants, if not one or more, in your backyard? Oh, wow. All right, so I am talking to the right audience tonight, okay? That's a good thing. Now, some of these are plants that you're thinking, well, I mean, they're native dogwoods, right? I mean, that should be a good plant to have around. Well, we're going to talk about some problems with dogwoods, as well as some of these others that are becoming more and more common, okay? There's always new diseases, there's always new pests and problems that we're having to deal with. And some of these are becoming more problematic and something that we need to think about. And so again, to describe these, I'm going to use some harsh language. See, this is some of the terminology that you'll see me scattered throughout the presentation tonight. I'll try to keep it PG for you though, okay? We're not going to do like the Dirty Dozen movie and start cussing up here, okay? But you will see these terms scattered throughout the presentation, so that can be a little scavenger hunt for you, okay? All right, so the first one is my anti-vaxxer plant, okay? Now, we all know that, plants don't have immune systems, so, we can't vaccinate them. But this is a plant, the knockout rose, actually gets a disease called, it's called rose rosette virus. Did you know that plants can get viruses? Okay. There's a lot of different plant viruses out there, but this one is very specific to roses. And the knockout rose is one of those that's planted everywhere. It's a very popular rose in the southeast because it's been bred to be resistant to other disease problems, specifically black spot disease. If you're familiar with growing roses in the southeast, that's the #1 problem of roses here. Because of our high humidity and temperatures and rainfall, you're going to get black spot disease, especially on tea roses and hybrids and that sort of thing. So you want to get a good rose variety that doesn't get or isn't susceptible to that black spot disease. But unfortunately, this new virus that's been circulating for the last several years in metro Atlanta and all over Georgia is something that rose is not immune to at all, okay? And have any of y'all seen this disease before? Okay, it's out there, I can assure you. It's all over Cartersville, and we're, in my county where I work. I can walk all over downtown Cartersville, and just about every business that has roses planted out front has this, okay, if I go looking for it. And it's a disease that, once you notice it, you'll start to see it everywhere kind of thing. It starts out with, the newest growth in the springtime will get kind of gnarly looking and kind of twisted up. And so you'll see this sort of, reddish coloration, which a lot of times the new growth on roses is going to have that reddish coloration starting out, but it's even more dramatic on those roses that are infected with the virus. Another symptom is that the leaves don't fully expand. They kind of stay stunted, and they'll get sort of this leaf strapping or shoestringing characteristic where they kind of curl up. And then another really key characteristic of this disease is over here on the right, you can see the thorns. We call that prolific thorn production, okay, or thorn proliferation. And typically a branch that's an inch or two long might only have a few thorns on it. Okay, you could easily count them, but in this case, there's more thorns than you can possibly count in that small section of stem. So the virus is causing this mutation in the plant, essentially. And there's a lot of different things that happen there, but essentially it kind of grows the plant to death. Ironically, there's a lot of herbicides that we use that have the same sort of symptomology. So some people might mistake this for an herbicide, a little bit of herbicide injury or something like that. But this is a virus that is systemic. It will move into the root system. And even if you cut off the branches or the top of the plant that looks bad, eventually it's going to come back. And the problem is because the plant becomes stunted, it's not able to put out enough leaves for photosynthesis. It starves itself to death. It doesn't kill the plant overnight. It takes a few years to kill it, but it will continue to decline in health, okay? And as I said, plants don't have immune systems, so we can't vaccinate them against this. There is no way to cure this. There's nothing we can spray on the plant to manage this disease. And if that's not bad enough, they also have a little mite that gets into roses that's a vector of this disease. So a lot of our sap-feeding insects like mites can pick up this virus, and then every leaf that they go and feed on, they're actually inoculating those leaves that they feed on, okay? Just like a mosquito carrying a virus or a parasite, right? And that's something that a lot of people focus on and say, well, if I do a good job of spraying for the mites, maybe I can reduce the spread of the disease, right? Well, these mites are tiny, okay? You'd have to have a pretty good magnifying glass just to see them, okay? And they're still smaller than a period, okay? And so this is not something that you can easily scout for and spray for because they're hiding up underneath the leaves and underneath the scales of the branches and the buds and whatnot. And again, it's almost impossible to find and keep it under control. And these mites, believe it or not, they're so tiny, they don't have wings, they don't fly. But they can actually do what's called a ballooning technique, where they'll actually pick up in the wind and kind of balloon in the wind. A lot of spiders use that technique as well to move around. So that's how small they are. They blow around in the wind. And so you can see how easy it would be for them to move from, not only within your yard, but from your neighbor's yard across the road or whatever, right? Now there's another way that this virus moves, okay? If you are out pruning your roses and you get the sap on your pruning tools, you can also inoculate every rose bush in your backyard with this virus, okay? So one of the management things that we try to tell people is, if you have landscapers, especially in commercial plantings where we see like hundreds of these planted out there, landscapers need to be aware of this because if their tools get contaminated with this virus and then they go to another landscape down the road, guess what? They just spread this virus throughout the whole neighborhood, okay? Now there is a simple solution to that. If you take the time to decontaminate your tools, at least between, we would recommend between each and every plant that you're pruning, but at least between job sites, using a Lysol disinfectant spray or rubbing alcohol, even bleach solution, you can cut that down to about a 10% bleach solution. You can put that on your tools, keep it mixed up and spray it onto the tools. Let it sit on there for about 10 seconds and that'll clean or disinfect those tools from the virus, okay? So let me ask you a question. How many landscapers do you think are taking the time? You laugh. You laugh, okay? But that's the problem. That's the problem, right? That's where this comes from, okay? That's the number one vector of this virus is humans, okay? So that's something to be aware of. And if you have roses in your yard, be careful about who prunes your roses and where the tools have been and that sort of thing, okay? Another issue that we see on roses is called rose sawfly. And this doesn't get just on, this gets on all kinds of roses. And every April we get a lot of calls about this, this particular issue. And believe it or not, sawflies are this tiny little worm-like creature, looks like a slug almost. And believe it or not, it's not a caterpillar, although it looks a lot like a caterpillar. But a sawfly, this is the larval stage that eventually becomes a wasp, okay? So sawflies actually become wasps. And the wasp, I guess you could say, is sort of beneficial because it's a predatory insect that feeds on other things in your yard. But the rose sawfly, when it's in that larval stage, can actually chew your holes. It looks like a holy war in your backyard, okay? It looks like Swiss cheese when they get done with it. And usually, again, we get calls about this. The first generation hatches out in April. That's when they cause the most damage. You can get a second and third generation later in the summer, but it's easy to control this. This is actually something that we do have a good control option for using a systemic insecticide like the Bayer tree and shrub products that has imidacloprid in it. That's about the only retail product you can get at Lowe's or Home Depot pretty easily. There are some other commercial products out there, but that's the one that you can get retail. And that's a drench application that you would do in the spring. You want to get it out there maybe in March before these guys start to hatch out. And one drench application, it's systemic, will move up into the leaves and protect that plant for the entire season. And that's it, once a year, okay? And if you've had these in the past, you can expect to see them probably the next year as well, okay? So you can plan or anticipate that and put out that application of the systemic insecticide before they hit your plants. But again, this is another problem that roses get. So, maybe we shouldn't be planting as many roses and maybe we need to look at other varieties. I will back up for a second and say that, the rose rosette virus is something that not only gets on knockout roses, but it gets on a lot of our other rose species as well. And there's a lot of research being done right now to try to figure out, which varieties are resistant. I'll be honest with you, there's not a lot of resistance out there, okay? There's a lot of universities that are looking at this. University of Georgia is looking at some trials right now. We're having to go back to the original species on some of these roses to try to breed them and find resistance. And what we're finding is they're not fully resistant sometimes. It's just sort of they tolerate the virus a little bit better and they have maybe a delay onset to those symptoms. And so instead of showing symptoms the first year, it may be the third or fourth year before they start showing symptoms, which, as you can imagine, makes it really difficult to breed those roses and evaluate them if you're looking at 4 or 5 years before the onset of symptoms, okay? So with that in mind, just be careful about where you buy your roses from. Make sure that they're certified and coming from clean nurseries, and try not to get this disease into your landscape in the first place, right? And again, going back to tools and sanitation and who's taking care of your roses, okay? Yeah, if you get this virus, the best advice is to dig up the plant and take it to the landfill or burn it, get rid of it, okay? Now, the cool thing about a virus is it doesn't survive in the soil, okay? There's a lot of other pathogens like fungal pathogens and bacteria and things. Those types of diseases can reside in the soil, sometimes for years, but a virus has to have a living host to survive. So if you pull out that rose, roots and all, you can plant another rose back there if you really wanted to, okay? But again, I would look at other varieties, and if you got other roses in that yard, they may be already infected, they just aren't showing symptoms yet. So you could recirculate that virus very, very easily, right? And if you have roots that maybe resprout from that rose bush that you pull up, they could also be carrying, in the root system still, okay? But it doesn't stay in the soil, so there's nothing you have to do with the soil there if you want to come back in and plant something else. Number 2 on my Dirty Dozen list is the Japanese holly. The main issue that they get is a root rot disease. We call it black root rot. And it's a specific disease that we see that gets into the roots. This is what the spores look like under a microscope. They're very darkly pigmented spores. that actually resist sunlight and don't break down like a lot of other diseases and other pathogens, when exposed to ultraviolet light will break down pretty quickly or die. But these can survive in the soil for years. And we find that these Japanese hollies are very susceptible to this, especially because I think we're pushing them outside of their zone. We plant these probably too far into the south. If you look at where these are native in Japan, Japan is closer to New York if you look at the where it is on the map, right? It's a different climate than Georgia, okay, as you can imagine. They really like that colder zone, zone 5, maybe all the way down to zone 7A at the most. Typically, 7A was in the North Georgia mountains, maybe in the higher elevations, but not metro Atlanta or south, okay? So they like the cooler environments. When they get heat stressed, when they get drought stressed, they get this disease, okay? So sooner or later, they're gonna be stressed and have those problems. If you go buy plants at a nursery, one of the ways that you can scout for this is to pull that plant out of the pot and look at the roots, right? What we like to see at the nursery is nice, white, healthy roots all the way down to the bottom of the pot. If you see just a few roots at the top and it's black on the bottom, that's got probably a disease, a root rot disease like this, okay? So that's not a plant that you want to bring home with you. It's very rare that a plant recovers from that type of a disease. And again, it's something that they're going to be very susceptible to in Georgia in the first place. The problem is we start to see dieback. We'll get a lot of calls about Japanese hollies, branch will die back, and you prune that out, and they're such a slow-growing plant that hole stays in the canopy for a long time. So people usually get frustrated by that and end up just taking the whole plant out eventually. So again, this is one that I'd say leave it for the more northern states. We've got lots of other hollies that we can grow in Georgia that are much better alternatives here. Some of our native hollies, like the Yopon holly, are going to be much better adapted to the heat in the southeast as far as our climate. Number 3 on my dirty dozen list is the Indian hawthorn. Okay, this is another evergreen shrub similar to the Japanese holly that's used as a foundation plant around homes. Very popular plant, but we see some issues with Indian hawthorn. One specific issue is a leaf spot disease that they get, which we'll talk about in a minute. But they also can sometimes get cold damage to the leaves. If you recall, a year ago Christmas, we had a really hard freeze that got down into the single digits. I don't know how cold it got down here in Noonan, but we saw 5 and 6 degrees up in Cartersville, okay? That doesn't happen every winter, right? But when we do get down into those teens or lower temperatures, some of our evergreen plants that we're pushing them to grow this far north, if you will, you're going to see a lot of dieback, or they may completely defoliate. And that's what we saw with the Indian hawthorns around metro Atlanta last winter, okay? And so it didn't kill the plants. They will leaf back out eventually. And we saw that with a lot of other evergreen plants. But again, their preference is zone 7B and south, okay? They do better in Florida than they do up here. And that temperature threshold is right around 0 to 5 degrees is when they start to defoliate. And the problem is when they flush back out with new growth in the springtime, all that new succulent green growth is going to be much more susceptible to this disease, okay? And so then what we see after that follows is Entomosporium leaf spot. This is a fungal disease. This is what the spores kind of look like under the microscope. It's got the word entomo, which sounds like entomology, because the spores actually look like little insects under the microscope with little legs hanging out, okay? So that's where that name comes from. This disease, you'll get spots on the leaves that kind of are circular in pattern. You'll get the center of that spot actually has a fruiting structure that produces hundreds of spores. And you'll get, multiple spots on a leaf, and of course, if you get enough of them, it's going to completely defoliate that plant again, okay? Plants have to have leaves, right? They have to feed themselves. People are like, well, can't I just fertilize it? No, fertilizer is not plant food, okay? Plants make their own food through photosynthesis, okay? And if you defoliate them enough, they're going to decline, they're going to die, they're going to starve to death eventually, okay? And so that's what we see with a lot of hawthorns. This is actually this disease also gets on the old red tip photinias, if you're familiar with those. That was another evergreen shrub that was really popular back in the 80s. And people planted those as screens and borders along their property lines. And again, it would defoliate those red tip photinias year after year after year, and eventually they starved to death, okay? Now this is a disease that you could spray for, okay? There are fungicides that will control this disease. But the question is, do you want to have to spray for this year after year after year? That's a lot of work for something that we, again, have a lot of other evergreen shrubs that are much better alternatives out there than something like this, okay? So again, I would say stay away from the hawthorns, unless you're further south especially. Stay away from the red tip photinias especially as well. Number 4 on my dirty dozen list is the Leland cypress, okay? Y'all are probably familiar with this. These are planted all over Georgia as a screen or for screening your neighbors and that sort of thing. Very popular, fast-growing evergreen tree, right? And they do what they're supposed to do. They grow very, very fast. In the plant world, things that grow fast tend to die quickly, okay? There's a direct correlation there, okay? They tend to be short-lived. A Leland cypress in Georgia might live, let's say 20 to 30 years if you're lucky. Okay, that's a really good, and that's in really good conditions, right? Now, one of the problems is how we plant them, okay? So people, not only are they a fast-growing tree, but they get impatient and they want them to fill in even faster because they really don't want to look at their neighbors, okay? So what do? Well, there's a lady standing here, and if you look really close, you can actually see the trunks or the stems of these trees. They're barely 3 feet apart there. I'm surprised that they live this long, okay? That's a lot of competition between trees for water and nutrients and sunlight, right? And we actually get a lot of calls about Lelands that are planted too close together because they shade themselves out on the interior branches, and those interior branches will die out just from a lack of sunlight, okay? It doesn't even have anything to do with disease. And y'all are smiling because you're like, yep, that's what happened to ours, right? Okay? The crazy thing about Lelands is, once that branch dies out, it doesn't come back, okay? And that's true with a lot of evergreen trees. There are a few exceptions, something like Japanese cedars, the cryptomerias, they actually can grow a whole new branch back after you cut it off, okay? But that's not very common in the evergreen world, okay? So that's a problem. And so if you start losing branches, whether it's from, lack of sunlight, or in the case of a disease that can kill those branches, you start to be able to wave at your neighbor through the tree eventually, okay? So the disease that we see on Leland cypress, the most common one here is called Ceridium canker. And this is a fungal disease that infects the branches of the tree. You'll get these sort of lesions, these sunken parts in the bark of the tree, and then you'll get sap that'll bleed out of those cankers, okay? So if you ever see that sap coming out, that's pretty much, you've confirmed that you have the disease. You don't need to waste your time taking it to the lab or the extension office, okay? I always say look for the sap. And if you see that discoloration in the bark, you can actually cut back the bark here or skin back the bark. And if you see some browning or staining underneath that bark layer, that's definitive that you have this disease, okay? Canker diseases, we don't have any fungicides or any cures for this type of a disease. It's inside the stem of that tree, right? So kind of think of it like a cancer. All we can do is cut it out, okay? So if you did have a branch that was infected and you happen to catch that one branch early enough, in theory, you could literally prune out that branch and stop the spread of that disease, okay? But the problem again is it's not going to put a new branch out. And you cut enough branches off, it's not going to look like a Leland cypress after a while, okay? So again, this is not a good plant for Georgia. One of the problems with Leland cypress is that, again, it's not very well adapted to Georgia in the southeast. If these trees just get a little bit of drought stress, a little bit of heat stress, bam, they're going to get this disease every single time, okay? Now, let me back up for a second. Have you ever seen the X in a botanical name of a plant before? Usually it's like between the genus and the species name, right? Okay, so that means it's a hybrid, okay? Well, in this case, it's at the beginning of that Latin name. before the genus. Have y'all ever seen that before? So what that means is that's a hybrid between two different tree genuses, not just species, but two genuses, okay? Does anybody know what the hybrid of the two trees or the parent trees of Leland cypress is? All right, I'll give you a hint. One of them is called Monterey cypress. Where do you think that's from? Monterey, California. The other one is Alaskan cedar. Not Georgia, okay? All right, neither one of those trees should be growing in Georgia. And here we have a hybrid between two West Coast species that love lots of moisture on the coast, lots of mist, cooler climates, milder climates. You know, you take either one of those trees and move them 50 miles inland in California, it's not gonna handle the drought, okay, or the heat. So that's where a lot of our problems come from. Now, if you do have, like if you've got to plant one of these in your backyard, look at how big they get. Over 100 feet tall and 15 feet wide. You should be spacing them out at least 15 feet apart if they have any chance of surviving in Georgia, okay? But again, there's many other evergreens that we can look at as alternatives. Things like the green giant arborvitaes and Japanese cedars are much better adapted to the southeast than this Leland cypress hybrid. What he doesn't list is boxwood blight, okay? So the boxwood is something that's been around, a big part of our culture in the Southeast, a big part of our landscapes for hundreds of years. We have lots of, plantation homes up along the Etowah River in Cartersville, where I live and where I grew up. A lot of those old plantation homes have, hundreds of boxwoods planted in the front yard that are these, really elaborate, parterres is what they call them, right? And those boxwoods have been there for hundreds of years in some cases. Now, we have a disease that could wipe them all out. And we're starting to see this all over Metro Atlanta. So if you have boxwoods in your yard, you need to listen up, okay? This is a disease that could show up. This is a fungal disease, and if you look at it under the microscope, this is what the spores look like. They have these long, sort of rod-shaped spores. They're very sticky spores, okay? They kind of clump together or stick together, as you can see here. They're kind of clumped together. So that should tell you something about how this disease spreads, okay? In this particular case, this disease will cause complete defoliation of the plant. And again, if we defoliate a plant enough times, eventually it's going to catch up with it, right? How this disease can spread in your landscape very, very easily, very quickly. These spores will stick to your clothes. So if you have a row of boxwoods and you happen to brush up against a plant and it sticks to your clothes and then you brush up against another plant, you could spread it down the whole row very quickly, okay? Another issue that we see commonly is people that have furry pets. Yeah, furry pets, these spores will stick to their fur pretty well, okay? So a cat or dog running through your boxwood hedge can easily spread these spores. And if they go down the road and get fed by your neighbor, and then they come back, they might also get some spores from somewhere else or spread it to your neighbor's house. It goes both ways, okay? So that's how we see this spread. Now this disease, some boxwoods, if they're in really good conditions, might leaf back out again, okay? That's a big might. But typically we see, boxwoods permanently damaged, and it's gonna keep coming back year after year. There isn't really any good fungicide options for this disease. The recommendation would be, to pull them out and burn them and take out all the debris, the mulch, everything. And that's hard. That's really hard to tell people when they got 100-year-old boxwoods in their front yard. That's not a conversation I enjoy having, okay? But sometimes that's necessary. So if you're one of those people that has just this elaborate boxwood collection, okay? If you want to protect yourself, there's at least 3 things that I would do, okay? First of all, I would make sure that all the tools that I use to prune those boxwoods are my tools, okay? Because again, just like the virus, the spores could stick to your tools, and if the landscaper's coming in from another site and they just did boxwood pruning the same day, they're probably going to inoculate your plants for you, okay? So all the tools that I'm going to use are going to stay on site, no tools from the outside brought in, okay? The other thing that I would do is if I did have a landscaper coming into my property to maintain these boxwoods, I would want to be the first stop of the day. Because again, how many landscapers are going to stop and change their clothes before they come to your house? Probably not going to happen, okay? It's the real world that we live in, right? So make sure that you're the first stop so that they're clean coming in the door, okay? And then the last thing I would probably do, and this is something that I recommend with some of our older homes in Cartersville, is if you have to replace a boxwood, let's say one just dies, maybe it's drought stress or something else, right? And you have to replace that boxwood, don't go buy a boxwood from a nursery, okay? Because there's a possibility that you could get it from a nursery. Now, the nurseries have done better the last couple of years, trying to, keep this out of the nursery trade, and they're inspecting for this, and there's even a boxwood compliance program where they're inspected and quote-unquote certified. But the problem with this is, in a nursery situation, they spray fungicides to control this disease. And the fungicides kind of mask the symptoms of this disease. So it's like a Trojan horse. You bring it home, it looks good when you put it in the ground, the fungicide starts to wear off, and guess what? You just brought home a diseased plant. You didn't even know it, okay? So in the case of, plants that you have to replace, I would propagate from my own stock, okay? So take cuttings, have a little nursery in your backyard where you're growing out some plants, and have a few ready to go in case you ever need to replace a boxwood. And again, this is in one of those extreme situations where we have hundreds of boxwoods in a landscape situation. Barnsley Gardens up in Bartow County is a good example of that, okay? They're gonna propagate from their own plants so they don't have to bring anything in, okay? Number 6 on my Dirty Dozen list is flowering cherries. Oh, I bet that's disappointing for some of y'all, isn't it? Okay. So, flowering cherries, put on a terrific show every spring. We have, entire, cherry festivals that are, built around these particular trees in some cities. But there is a disease that they get. It's called shot hole disease. And the name is very apt because you get these holes all over the leaves. It looks like Swiss cheese. It's actually caused by a combination of a fungus and a bacterium that colonizes the leaf tissue starting out in the early spring. And if we have a really wet, warm spring, those ideal conditions for this disease, it'll start out with some sort of yellow spots on the leaves, and then those yellow spots will eventually turn sort of necrotic or brown in the center. And then what's really interesting is in the later stages of this disease, the hole will actually fall out from the center of that. So when people see this, their first assumption is that it's an insect chewing holes in their leaves, right? It looks like Japanese beetles or a caterpillar was chewing on your tree. But in this case, it's actually a disease that's causing these symptoms, okay? And if this disease continues to progress, if it starts out early enough in the spring and continues through the summer, you will have the tree completely defoliate by midsummer. And that's usually when the extension office starts getting calls, right? Right around the end of July, early August, they're like, my tree is dying because it just dropped all of its leaves. There's not a leaf left on my Yoshino cherry in my backyard. What do I do about it? Well, in this case, believe it or not, it doesn't kill the tree, at least not right away. Most mature trees can tolerate this disease pretty well. They just kind of go into an early dormancy in August, okay? There's some homeowners associations out there that hate that because they have these planted along the entrance on both sides of the road for as far as you can see, and in August all the trees go dormant, and they freak out about it every year. Okay, so that's that can be problematic. Some cherry trees are more more susceptible than others. The Yoshino variety is by far the most susceptible out of all the cherries that are out there, but this can get on a lot of other cherry species. The Kwanzan cherries are not quite as susceptible, but again, it's still a problem. So this is a disease, again, it's a fungal disease that gets on the leaves. So we could spray for this. There are great fungicides. We have lots of fungicides on the market that we can use for leaf spot diseases, okay? But again, the problem is, do you want to have to spray this every single year, okay? And then if we're talking about big trees, from a practical standpoint, how are you gonna spray a 30-foot tall tree, that can be problematic and very costly to do that, okay? So we typically say, don't worry about it. Because again, it's not gonna kill your tree. You just have to tolerate it, okay? They're gonna look like crap every summer. They're gonna drop their leaves. But every spring they'll flower for you. They look good, okay? And they'll come back out and be perfectly fine. Now, this is a disease that also gets on other species in the cherry family. Another shrub that we plant very commonly here in Georgia is called a cherry laurel, which is an evergreen shrub that's used as a foundation planting around homes. The autoleucon variety is one of the more popular ones. I don't know why it's one of the more popular ones, because this is what it looks like when it gets the disease, okay? It's even more dramatic than the cherry trees, right? I mean, it really does look like an insect chewed holes in those leaves. And the problem too is that these are evergreen. So not only do they shed their leaves and, like your flowering cherries would put out new leaves in the spring, so they look good in the spring. But these guys are evergreen. So evergreen plants don't shed their leaves every year. So those holes are going to be there for at least 3 years on those leaves before they start to cycle through and put out some new leaves to replace them. Okay, so they always look like, well, you have like layers of Swiss cheese and new growth, and then it gets the Swiss cheese look, and then it's kind of weird, right? And again, you could spray for this, but it's a lot of work to have to spray for them every year. And these are so susceptible to this disease, I wouldn't even recommend planting them. I wish the nursery industry would just get away from the cherry laurels altogether. So again, this is something that is a big problem. Another issue with cherry trees is, if they defoliate year after year after year, or especially in the summertime, cherry trees are very susceptible to sun scald or bark splitting injury. And so when that bark on the main trunk of that tree is exposed to more sunlight in the summertime, they're more likely to crack and split. And if you've ever seen that on a cherry tree, it's pretty dramatic. Usually it's on the western or the southern side as far as exposure to that tree trunk. And again, that could be related to the fact that they're defoliating in midsummer and they're going to be more exposed because of that. And again, that's a physiological issue that's not going to kill that tree right away, but it's going to shorten the life of that tree. So that means that a cherry tree in metro Atlanta or the southeast might live 20, 30 years if you're lucky. Okay, they're not going to live 100 years like an oak tree. Okay, so your expectation should be, this is a specimen tree. If we get 20 or 30 years out of it, we're doing really good, and we're going to replace it every 30 years. Okay, that should be your expectation if you plant one of these trees. Number 7 on my Dirty Dozen list is the Bradford pear tree. Okay, we love to hate them. It's another tree that people can't, seem to resist because it has one of the best, flower shows in the early spring. It's one of the first bloomers that we have, and puts on quite a flower show. But this is another tree that has some other issues. It's not a disease in this case. It's the structure of how the tree grows, okay? So some trees have stronger branch attachments than others, right? So the strongest branch attachment is about 45 degrees. That's what we like, trees to have a good branch structure. As you can see on the Bradford pear, they have branches that go straight up. That's a very weak attachment for those branches. And that's just the natural form of the tree. And nobody takes the time to prune these, on the day you plant them, you should start pruning them and trying to train those branches like an edible pear tree. But they become problematic, and usually once those branches hit about 20 years old, they start to split apart because we get what's called bark inclusion, where the V is in the center of that acts like a wedge. As that branch starts to grow and expand, it will actually tear itself apart under the sheer weight of it. And then all it takes is a good storm, like we had today, blows through town, and every Bradford pear tree that's 25 years old self-destructs, okay? So this is a tree that, again, is short-lived, not one that I would recommend. Another problem with Bradford pears is when people cut these down, they are grafted trees. And so if you know what that means, if they're grafted, they're basically clones. So every Bradford pear is a clone of the original Bradford pear that was discovered 80 years ago, okay? And so when they graft that, they're grafting that onto a rootstock called calorie pear, okay? Now, if you've heard of calorie pear, this is an invasive species, okay? The wild calorie pears that grow out of that rootstock, let's say you cut the tree down and it starts to resprout. A lot of people don't recognize or know what is happening, and they're like, oh, it's coming back from the roots, we're gonna let it grow, yay! And then, 20 years later, you got this ugly tree with thorns that are 4 inches long hanging off of it, okay? So that's the wild pears have these thorns. And these thorns could puncture a hole in a tire, okay? And these trees are extremely prolific. The wild type calorie pear is one that will produce seeds and it will spread. The birds will eat these seeds and they will come up everywhere. And so in Georgia and all across the southeast, we have wild calorie pears coming up in the forest. This is as bad as kudzu, folks. It will take over entire farms. I've seen fields in Bartow County where I live, 50 acres of nothing but Bradford pear or calorie pear with thorns like that. If you ever decide to come back into that farm and try to renovate it, you'd have to have a bulldozer to take them down. That's how bad the thorns are. So that's something that we want to prevent, okay? So if you cut down your Bradford pear, which I strongly recommend, okay, just get rid of it. Make sure you treat the stump, okay? Grinding it out's not gonna kill it because the root system will have 1,000 suckers that'll come up, okay? So the only way you're gonna kill that stump is with a stump herbicide application. And this needs to be done when that stump is still green. And you would actually paint that herbicide right around the edge. You don't have to paint the whole stump. And get you a glyphosate herbicide that you can get at Lowe's or Home Depot. Just get the cheap stuff. It's the off-brand Roundup is what that is, okay? That's the easiest and cheapest thing. Get the highest concentrate you can find, like 40%, and just paint it right on the stump. And that herbicide hopefully will work its way into the root system and kill the entire root system of that tree. And of course you'll want to monitor that for a couple of years and just make sure there's no other sprouts that come up and treat those as needed, okay? But this is a serious issue. This is a major invasive species threat that displaces a lot of our other native trees and other native species that we don't want. Number 8 on my dirty dozen list is the dogwood, our native dogwood. Unfortunately, dogwoods have a lot of issues. One of the bigger issues that's been around, this is actually something that we've had for a while. Anthracnose disease, I think it's been around for 40 or 50 years in our native dogwoods, but you'll get these leaf spots from this fungal disease. It not only gets on the leaves, but also affects the bracts. The flower bracts are basically modified leaves on that flower structure. So you can get some spotting there, defoliation of the tree, which is going to stress that tree and shorten the life of that tree if it happens year after year. Sometimes you get a little bit of tip dieback. The botanical name for this disease, Discula destructiva, should be very descriptive there for you. It destroys the tree basically over time. This is a disease that, in a landscape situation, if you had one dogwood tree, you could potentially spray for it, but it is something you'd have to spray for probably year after year. And then another issue that we see with dogwoods, especially in urban environments, is a clear-winged moth called a dogwood borer. And these borers typically attack trees that are very stressed. So think of trees that are, in urban landscapes that are planted in too much sun, a little bit of heat stress, a little bit of drought stress on it. They're going to be very susceptible to these moths. And they bore into the trunk of the tree and eventually can girdle the stem of that tree and kill it. Okay, so this is a problem for a lot of our native dogwoods, especially when we plant our native dogwoods outside of their comfort zone, right? Dogwoods are an understory tree. They like to be in part shade. They don't want to have western or southern, sun exposure on them. But where does everybody plant their dogwoods? Right in the front lawn, because they want to see it when they walk in the door. Okay, that's the worst place to plant your dogwood. Okay, they're going to get all these issues. So an alternative that I would recommend is the Coosa dogwood. Coosa dogwoods are not native to Georgia. In fact, Coosa dogwoods are native to northern China and Korea is where they originate. But they do very well in our climate, believe it or not. And they're much more tolerant of sun and urban conditions. And they're not as susceptible to these two issues that we just talked about. It's not the same as our native dogwood, right? It blooms, the flowers are a little bit smaller, they bloom a little bit later in the spring than our native dogwoods do. But if you've got to have a dogwood in your front yard in full sun, plant a Coosa dogwood, okay? Another really cool thing about the Coosa dogwoods, if you've ever seen the fruit on these things, it actually produces a fruit. It is an edible fruit. It's kind of mealy and not exactly something you go out and make jams and jellies out of, but you could eat it. So it's a fun little snack in your front yard and a conversation piece, okay? Another issue that we see on dogwoods that's becoming more of an issue, I believe, and there's some other sort of unknown issues with our native dogwoods that we still haven't quite pinpointed yet, but we're seeing this sort of rapid decline in recent years. And one of the sort of smoking guns that we're looking at is the black twig borer. And this is basically an ambrosia beetle that's very, very tiny. These beetles are about as small as the tip of a pinhead. So if you have an ink pen or a pencil, look at the tip of that pencil. That's how small these beetles are. but they cause a lot of damage. They will bore into the branches of the tree. Unlike our other ambrosia beetles that we have that'll invade the main stem or the trunk of the tree, these only attack the outer twigs, okay? But again, you'll see some dieback, and eventually, if you get enough dieback, that tree's gonna starve to death, okay? So it's just one more thing that our native dogwoods are having to deal with. And the other issue is, that we're seeing these beetles more active. And it has to do with maybe the milder winter weather that we've had in recent years. They tend to emerge earlier in the spring and attack dogwoods year after year. So that's something that can be an issue or more problematic when we have the milder winters. And then they're called ambrosia beetles because they carry a fungus. Believe it or not, these beetles don't eat the plant, okay? They're just tunneling into the wood of that plant to lay their eggs, and that's where the larvae hatch out, okay? And when the larvae hatch out, they actually will feed on this ambrosia fungus as they move through the tunnels. So the beetles actually carry this fungus, the spores of the fungus, in their, on the outside of their body, and they're inoculating the tunnels as they go through the tree, okay? And so this fungus, believe it or not, can also kill the tree, okay? It's kind of another one that you can't even see it happening. So even if you pruned out the branches that were affected by the twig borers, if they've already inoculated this tree with the fusarium fungus, that can start to stop the flow or clog the flow of water and nutrients in the vascular system of that tree. And that's something that we can't treat for. And a symptom of that, you'll see wilting and dieback associated with that as well. So again, all these sort of complex issues happening with dogwoods, and we don't have good cures for these issues, okay? So again, I would probably unfortunately, stay away from native dogwoods, okay? Dozen list is euonymus. This is another evergreen shrub that's pretty popular. There's a lot of different variegated varieties out there that have really pretty color variations in the leaves. And again, this is commonly planted as a foundation shrub around houses. But they get some issues. One of the issues they get is a scale. It's called euonymus scale because it's very specific to this particular host. But you'll get millions of these scales all along the branches, all over the leaves. These scales are very, very tiny. They're different than other insects that you might be familiar with. They don't move. They're sedentary, okay? Now they do, when they hatch out of their eggs in the springtime, they do move. There's actually, right here, you can see one little, that's what we call that the crawler stage, okay? And they only crawl for about a week, and then they find a spot that they want to settle down, they stick their mouth part in a leaf, and they start taking the sap out, and they stay there for the rest of their life, okay? So you don't see these crawling around typically, okay? But they can move, and then these crawlers are very sticky, and so they tend to stick to the feet of birds and other animals, and so that's how they move from plant to plant, okay? So birds and animals are actually the vector here. And again, you get enough of these feeding on the sap of that plant, it's gonna stress that plant and kill it. Trying to control these is very, very difficult. Pesticides rarely penetrate the older scales because they have a really tough sort of outer covering, almost like a shell on the outside that pesticides won't penetrate. And then when you get this many on a plant, it's kind of like too little too late. You should have sprayed that like 2 years ago. And at that point, you're better off just cutting it out, okay? If you had just 1 or 2 branches that were infested, I might just cut out that one branch. But once a whole plant kind of looks like that, you're better off just cutting your losses and plant something else, okay? Because sooner or later, they're gonna get this insect issue again. Another problem with euonymus is powdery mildew. This is not a major disease. They can tolerate it pretty well, but it's unsightly. Who wants this powdery mildew growing all over the leaves? And we see this, on the new green succulent growth on the plants every summer here in Georgia. You could spray for this, but again, it's something you'd have to spray for every single year. Nobody wants to do that, okay? Much better alternatives out there than the euonymus. And I'm going to show you some examples of alternatives at the end. Number 10 on my list is impatiens, a very popular annual flower that's used for landscaping. Grandparents and great-grandparents used to plant these all the time in their backyard, really popular heirloom flower. But they get a new disease that's been around for a few years now called downy mildew. In fact, this disease, it will completely defoliate the plant. It'll drop all of its leaves. And it's an annual. It's only going to live for 1 year, so it's not going to have time to really replace those leaves, right? So they're done at that point. This disease is so bad that the landscape industry kind of stopped growing a lot of impatiens about 5 or 6 years ago. You couldn't even find them at local nurseries, if you remember. And of course, the nursery industry got a lot of pushback, and there's a lot of demand out there, and they answer their customers' demand, and guess what? They're growing impatiens again, okay? Now, hopefully, nurseries are doing a much better job of managing this disease and making sure they're getting good, clean cuttings in and not hopefully spreading this disease in the industry. But it's something that could still be out there. And again, once you get it in your landscape, you wouldn't want to plant impatiens there the following year because it can stay in the soil for a couple of years. So you'd want to rotate to something else as far as annual flowers in that bed. It only affects the impatiens, so you don't have to worry about other species. A good alternative would be your New Zealand or New Guinea impatiens. They're much more tolerant to this disease if you wanted to look at a replacement. By the way, if you want to diagnose this disease, the spores are on the underside of the leaf. You have to turn it over to see those spores, okay? So the way I remember that is downy mildew is on the downside of the leaf, whereas powdery mildew is on the top side of the leaf, okay? That's one quick way that you can kind of tell the difference between downy mildew and powdery mildew. They look very similar though. Number 11 on my dirty dozen list is the American elm. And y'all are all probably, those of you that recall, back in the 40s and 50s, no, y'all aren't that old. Y'all aren't that old. But the American elm pretty much went extinct in North America, right? Okay, Dutch elm disease wiped it out, okay? Now, if you recall, pretty much every major city in North America at one time had an elm street, right? And they would line these streets with it. Elm trees are great urban trees because they have really high canopies that are great for traffic flow and sidewalks and everything else. A very popular urban tree. But unfortunately, they fell by the wayside because of Dutch elm disease. Well, they made a comeback. They bred the elm tree to be resistant to Dutch elm disease. And so some of the newer varieties that you'll see out on the market now are like Princeton elm. If you've heard about these, they're planted all over Georgia now. But they are resistant to the disease, but they can still get bark beetles. And bark beetles are a problem that's common with a lot of our native elms. We have other elms that are common here, like the winged elm, the red elm, slippery elm. There's other ones that grow well here. Chinese elms even grow well here. But they can get these bark beetles, and typically they like to attack trees that are stressed from drought stress or heat stress, okay? And I've seen some of the Princeton elms. Again, they're not getting the Dutch elm disease, but we have some plantings in Cartersville. A guy called me up a few years ago. He had probably 100 of them planted down his driveway. He had a long driveway. And about half of his trees were infested with these elm bark beetles. And they were starting to die back, dropping leaves in the middle of the summer and dying, okay? And there's nothing you can do. Once these bark beetles get in the tree, there's nothing we can do to treat for this. They're protected under that bark layer, and nothing, the pesticides aren't going to penetrate that or have any effect on them. So they can kill the trees too, okay? And so you want to diversify your trees and not plant the same thing. Maybe one American elm in my backyard, I wouldn't plant 100 of them, okay? But something to be aware of. And then number 12, my last one on the dirty dozen list, is the hackberry tree, okay? So the hackberry tree is not a tree that anybody in their right mind would plant in their backyard, okay? Anybody know what a hackberry tree is? Okay, it's a native tree to Georgia, grows everywhere. You can walk 20 feet out in the woods here and you can probably find a dozen hackberry trees, okay? They're very, very common native trees. But they're the ugliest native tree known to man. Okay, they don't sell them at nurseries because nobody wants to buy them. Okay, they're just plain ugly. There's no other way to describe them. Okay, now, as if that's not bad enough, they now get a woolly aphid that started attacking them about 20 years ago. I think this showed up around the Augusta area on the coast of Georgia and has since spread throughout all of Georgia. And these aphids get the name woolly aphid because they look like little sheep running around. They're really fuzzy little white aphids. They're woolly. In fact, this is kind of what they look like up close. I think they're kind of cute running around. But they are sap-feeding insects. And so aphids, when they feed on the sap of those leaves, that sap will come out and they're very messy feeders. It'll drip all over the leaves, and then that sap will mold. And we call that sooty mold, okay? And so it turns the leaves and the whole tree black because of that. So usually by midsummer, everything's turning black. And not only that, they're dripping sap under everything under the tree. So if you got azaleas planted under your tree, they're gonna be black. A lady even brought me a rock to the office and said, even the rocks under my tree are turning black, okay? So the sooty mold is not the disease, it's the aphids that you gotta worry about. So you gotta look up, and it's what's in that tree feeding on those leaves that's causing all this nuisance, okay? So yeah, everything under that tree. So if you park your car underneath a hackberry tree, guess what's gonna happen? It's gonna turn black, okay? And that's a mess. We see them around swimming pools and the decks in their backyard. Everything turns black, okay? So what is the solution to this? Cut it down. Or move. Just don't disclose it, you know. Just sell your house and get out of there, okay? Cut down every hackberry tree that's close to anything that you would park under it or plant under it, because this is not a desirable tree to have in your backyard. But we do get a lot of calls about these. It's fun to talk about. It's something to be aware of. So alternatives. So we talked about all the trees that we don't want, all the plants that we don't want in our landscape. There's a lot of small, medium trees that we can look at as far as alternatives. We talked about the Coosa dogwood already. Crepe myrtles are pretty tough trees if you don't prune them to death, okay? You've probably all heard of crepe myrtle, right? Everybody hacks them off every year. You're shortening the life of that crepe myrtle, okay? Let it become a tree. That's what it's supposed to do. Give it room to grow, and it will live a very long time in Georgia. And there are hundreds of crepe myrtle varieties. There are some that only get 3 feet tall, some that only get 10 feet tall, and some that'll get 30 feet tall. Get the variety that you need to fit your space. Don't try to keep a 30-foot tree next to your sidewalk and make it a 10-foot tree, because it's never gonna work. It's like trying to keep a cat in a bag, right? So get the right variety for your landscape. Bald cypress is a terrific tree. You know, bald cypress is one of our few coniferous trees that actually sheds its needles in the wintertime. So a very interesting sort of different landscape look. But I think it's an underutilized tree in our landscapes, one that does very well near houses. You're not gonna have lots of big branches hanging over your house when they mature. They will provide shade in the summertime, and then they'll let sunlight through when they shed their needles in the wintertime. So it's kind of a neat tree to have. A lot of people say, well, what about the knees? You know, the cypress knees that you see in Okefenokee Swamp, right? Well, those knees are not gonna come up in your backyard if it's dry land, okay? They only come up if there's a lot of water there, okay? Ginkgo tree is an old standby. It's literally been around for millions of years, okay? So that's a tree that's pretty tough. Beautiful fall color on ginkgos. If you've ever seen ginkgos, that golden yellow color, just absolutely beautiful as far as fall color. Nothing else tops that. River birches are pretty good for here. Red buds, either native red buds, the Texas red buds. There's a white red bud, ironically, that has white flowers. So a lot of options there. Maples are pretty tough here, whether we're talking about Japanese maples, sugar maples. I wouldn't do silver maples. That's the one that I don't like because they have very weak branches, kind of like a Bradford pear. But all the other maple species are fine here. Zelkova and lacebark elms, they're both in the elm family. Those are good alternatives to the American elm and a smaller tree. So again, a lot of options there for fall color, like the red maple. One footnote on the maples, we did see some issues with maples last year. So again, going back to that freeze event during Christmas a year ago, a lot of our maples did not fully acclimate last winter. So if you recall, in early December, we were in the 70s, and then it got down to single digits a week or two later in December of that year. And a lot of maples were not fully acclimated, so they still had sap flowing. And when that happens, they will actually split. And we saw frost cracks or freeze cracks that went from the roots all the way up into the canopy of maple trees. We're talking like sugar maples and red maples that they grow in Canada. They can tolerate cold weather if they have time to acclimate. And they didn't have time to acclimate last winter, and we saw a lot of maple trees die this past year. And it's because of that. That was just a freak sort of cold weather event that we don't see very often here. And then again, a lot of shrubs, hollies. There's so many different hollies, native hollies that do well here, different viburnums. You could plant your whole landscape in different viburnums and you wouldn't even know they're all the same plant. Okay, that's how many different viburnums they have out there. Loropetalums, there's a lot of different varieties there, different colors. Azaleas are good old standbys for Georgia. Abelias are becoming very popular. There's a lot of hybrid abelias out there with every color variation you can imagine. One of my favorite ones is called Kaleidoscope that has splashes of red and gold in the leaves. Just a really pretty landscape plant. Gardenias are pretty tough. Occasionally they'll get some white flies that are pretty easy to keep in check, but otherwise a tough plant for Georgia. Camellias, y'all got one over here that's a door prize. That's a good plant for Georgia, okay? Doesn't get hardly any insect or disease issues. Yews, you can plant those even in shade, deep shade. And that's an evergreen plant that kind of looks like a fern out in the woods. Very, very tough plant, very drought tolerant plant. So those are some of my favorites that I would highly recommend as alternatives to the ones that we talked about today. So if you want more information about these plants, check out our publication website at the University of Georgia. I think y'all do a good job of promoting that. But you can scan our website and pull up some of these publications that give you more information about what we talked about tonight. So with that, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions that you might have about the Dirty Dozen list or any other plants that you might want to talk about tonight. Again, there's a lot of things out there that we overuse, we overplant. The biggest key is just diversifying your landscape. Don't plant 50 of the same thing, because sooner or later, if you get a problem, it's going to affect every one of those plants that are all the same, right? So diversity kind of slows down the spread of those diseases and problems. Don't plant a whole row of Leland cypress. Plant a few hollies. They're evergreen. Plant a few southern magnolias. Those are evergreen. Plant some arborvitaes, plant some Japanese cedars, mix it up. And actually, it's going to be a much more attractive screen than a row of just Leland cypress, okay? So diversity is the key there. That would be the take-home message that I would give you tonight. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
The cypress tree, I've lived in Florida for a long time, and those cypress there are really big trees.
You're talking about bald cypress trees, or? Okay, yeah, so you're asking about different balls or different cypress trees that you can grow in the South in general. Yeah, there's Arizona cypress. There's so many different types out there, but if it's a hybrid, especially the hybrid Lelands, I would stay away from those because they're going to be short-lived here. So, yeah, do your homework. And check out our publication on landscape plants for Georgia. It lists the evergreen trees that we would recommend here specifically. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
There was some sort of a disease that got a lot of the maples in Noonan. Do you know what that was? A lot of the maples just died. They planted a bunch in our...
So there was a disease affecting maple trees specifically, is what you're asking.
I don't know what kind of a maple tree it was.
Oh, okay.
Because I didn't have one.
Well, it could have been the freeze event that we saw last year. Was it more recent or further back? Oh, okay. Okay. Not sure, what would have been the problem here locally, but yeah. Not something that I was on my radar, no. Yeah, generally speaking, I would be fine with most maples in Georgia. Yep. Yes, ma'am?
Off topic, I need a used pitchfork. I'm not willing to buy one for $50 at Home Depot.
Yeah, a good pitchfork is expensive, isn't it? Yeah.
Anyone have a used one?
All right, yeah. Maybe look in the, sometimes you can find some really old tools in the Farmers Market Bulletin. That's a good place to shop around and see if you can find some things like that might be useful. Yep. The Farmers Market Bulletin that's put out by the Georgia Department of Agriculture. It's basically like a yard sale ad for farmers all across the state of Georgia. So, yep. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Talking about boxwoods earlier, I noticed this year that after the cold we had last winter, the boxwoods are really a lot of ours as well. A lot of spots and branches. Is that due to the cold or due to the disease?
So boxwoods, your question is regarding, boxwoods last winter showing some damage that was not boxwood blight. And so a lot of times we'll see a couple of different things with boxwoods. One, they can get what we sort of call a bronzing or winter bronzing on the foliage. They'll kind of turn an off green color, almost a reddish color sometimes. They may defoliate some of their leaves, but that's something that typically they're going to grow out of, not something we have to worry a whole lot about. But they do kind of look a little off color going into the spring some years. And that's just with extreme cold weather. Secondary to that is if we do get a little bit of tip dieback, from the cold weather, you may get a disease called Volutella blight. That's another fungal disease that gets into boxwoods, but that's not lethal to the plant. You'll just get a little bit of branch dieback, some defoliation associated with that. Usually if you just prune that out, kind of open it up and give it a little more sunlight, it's going to grow out of it and be perfectly fine. So not, those other diseases we don't worry about as much on boxwoods. So, yep. All right.
Any more
I
questions?
think we're winding down here. All right. Well, thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed it. Yep.